The morning Mark left for his 3-day consulting conference in Chicago, Natalie stood by the front door and watched his car roll slowly down the gravel path until it disappeared behind the tall sea oats lining the coastal road. The Outer Banks cottage they shared sat quietly on a low dune, its wide windows catching the first pale light of the Atlantic. On most days, Natalie found comfort in its quiet beauty. But every time Mark traveled, something about the house changed. The rooms felt bigger, the silence lasted longer, and the stillness left too much space for thoughts she preferred not to have. She locked the door and pulled her hair into a loose knot, already planning how she would fill the empty hours. What she didn't know that morning was that before the day was over, one moment inside that house would quietly cross a line she never thought she would approach. And after that, nothing in that house would feel quite the same again. She changed into a light gray tank top and soft cotton shorts, connected her phone to the living room speaker, and let a quiet indie folk playlist drift through the air. Music always helped. Keeping busy helped more. She moved from room to room, wiping counters, folding blankets, straightening the shelves where Mark kept his collection of carefully arranged model sailboats. She liked mornings like this. Quiet, predictable, safe. For a little while, she almost felt peaceful. She was standing on a short wooden stool near the tallest bookshelf, stretching to reach a decorative lantern coated in a thin layer of dust, when she suddenly became aware of someone behind her. Not a sound, just presence. The small, instinctive alarm that makes the back of your neck tighten before your brain catches up. She turned. Ethan was leaning against the doorway. Mark's 22-year-old son from his first marriage had been staying with them for several weeks, working remotely while applying for summer internships. Most mornings, he barely appeared before noon. He wasn't supposed to be awake yet. His dark hair was still slightly disordered from sleep, his arms loosely crossed, his expression calm. But his eyes were fully awake, watching her in a way that felt a second too long to be accidental. "Good morning, Ethan," Natalie said, keeping her tone light. He gave a small nod, a faint, crooked half-smile. "Morning." The word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. He moved to the sofa and stretched out casually, but his attention never fully left her. Natalie turned back toward the shelf, telling herself it meant nothing. Just morning grogginess, just coincidence. She rose onto her toes again. The stool shifted slightly on the uneven hardwood floor. The movement was small, but enough. Her ankle tilted, her balance slipped, her fingers caught only air. For one sharp second, gravity pulled her sideways. "Natalie?" Ethan was already moving. Before the word fully left his mouth, his arms were around her waist, pulling her firmly back against him before she could hit the floor. The music kept playing. The waves kept breaking outside. But inside the room, something else had suddenly gone very still. She could feel his heartbeat against her back. Fast, strong, too close. His breath touched the side of her neck as his hand stayed firmly against her ribs for just a moment longer than necessary, as if letting go required a decision. She let out a small, nervous laugh and stepped forward. "Good thing you were here." That could have ended badly. But the distance between them disappeared slowly. And when she turned back toward him, he was still close enough that she could see the small golden flecks in his brown eyes. He wasn't smiling. His expression was open, unfiltered, concern, and something else he wasn't trying very hard to hide. Something that made her pulse rise in a way she immediately tried to ignore. Later, they sat on the sofa with coffee neither of them really drank. Natalie asked about his internship applications. Ethan talked about a few companies. The conversation worked, technically, but something underneath it kept pulling the pauses longer than normal silence. At one point, he looked directly at her again with that same steady focus and said quietly, "Sometimes it feels like we understand each other better than we probably should." Natalie's fingers tightened slightly around her mug, and the ocean breeze coming through the window suddenly felt much colder against her skin. Natalie knew she should have stood up from that sofa the moment his words landed between them. She didn't. The indie folk track shifted into something slower, soft guitar notes filling the space between them, like a quiet confession neither of them was ready to name. Ethan's eyes never left hers. She set her mug down. The small click of ceramic against wood sounded far too loud in the silence. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I know this probably sounds strange, but mornings like this, sitting here with you, They feel more real than anything else in my life right now. Heat crept slowly up Natalie's neck into her cheeks. Say something normal. That was what she should have done. Mention Mark, mention dinner, mention groceries, anything ordinary enough to break whatever invisible current was building between them. Instead, she heard herself say, "I feel it too." The words escaped before her judgment could stop them. Ethan's expression changed instantly. The hesitation faded, replaced by something open and unguarded, honest in a way that made her chest tighten. He reached toward her slowly, carefully, as if giving her every possible second to pull away. She didn't. His hand settled over hers on the cushion between them. Warm, steady, certain. The simple contact sent a quiet shock through her body that had nothing to do with the cool ocean air drifting through the open window. She looked down at their hands, then back at his face. And in that small space of time, she saw the last of his restraint disappear. He moved closer, not suddenly, not aggressively, just enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Her breath caught, and with a sharp flash of both panic and longing, she realized something that frightened her more than his touch. She wasn't moving away. She wasn't pulling her hand free. She wasn't doing any of the things a woman married to his father should have been doing. When his lips finally touched hers, the outside world seemed to fade into distant white noise. The kiss was careful at first, almost questioning, as if both of them were silently asking whether this moment would hold or collapse beneath them. His mouth was soft, hesitant, and Natalie felt something inside her begin to open. Something she had kept sealed behind years of routine, responsibility, and being the person everyone expected her to be. She kissed him back, and that was the moment the line truly disappeared. The gentleness deepened into something neither of them had planned, but both of them had clearly felt building. Weeks of glances that lasted too long, conversations that ended too late, feelings neither of them had allowed themselves to name. Ethan's hand moved from hers to her cheek, his thumb tracing lightly along her jaw like he was trying to memorize something he knew he shouldn't want. The slight tremor in his fingers affected her more than confidence would have, because it told her he was just as afraid. She placed her hand against his chest. His heart was racing, fast, uneven, matching her own. He pulled back just enough to look at her, their foreheads nearly touching. When he spoke, his voice sounded strained, exposed. "I've tried to stop thinking about you, Natalie, I really have. But every day it just gets harder." She closed her eyes. This was the moment she could still stop everything. Stand up, walk away, end it. Her conscience knew exactly what to do. Her body refused. When she leaned toward him again, the second kiss carried no uncertainty, only urgency, as if both of them understood they were stepping into something they would not easily step back out of. His arms wrapped around her. She could feel his breathing against her, rising and falling with the same unstable rhythm she felt in herself. Time passed without either of them noticing. The morning light shifted slowly across the floor, the pale gold brightness turning into the sharp white clarity of late morning. At some point, Natalie rested her head against his shoulder. His fingers moved gently through her hair, absent-minded, careful. For small stretches of time, she forgot who she was supposed to be, forgot the role, forgot the rules, forgot the version of herself she had spent years trying to be. The guilt never disappeared. It moved underneath everything instead, like a quiet current beneath still water. But in those suspended moments, it couldn't compete with the warmth of his arm around her, or the careful way he pressed his lips against her temple, like she was something fragile, something he shouldn't want, something he wanted anyway. The sharp vibration of her phone finally broke the fragile illusion. Natalie sat up immediately. Her heart dropped when she saw Mark's name glowing on the screen across the kitchen. Reality snapped back without mercy. She stood quickly, smoothing her tank top with hands that weren't completely steady, and walked into the kitchen without looking back. Her voice sounded almost normal when she answered. Mark talked about conference panels, a restaurant he had discovered downtown, small details from a completely different world. She laughed where she was supposed to, said she missed him, said she loved him. Every word tasted dry in her mouth. When the call ended, she stayed still for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter and staring out at the endless movement of the ocean. Behind her, she heard Ethan stand. His footsteps were quiet. He stopped in the doorway but didn't come closer. Something between them had changed, not gone. Changed. No longer warm and suspended. Now heavy with consequence. Natalie didn't turn around. She knew if she looked at him, she would see the same impossible mixture of tenderness and regret she was trying to hold together inside herself. Outside, the waves continued their steady rhythm, unconcerned, unchanging. Inside the cottage, two people stood on opposite sides of a line they both knew they could never uncross. And both of them understood, without saying it out loud, that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them was prepared for. Mark's car pulled into the gravel driveway 2 days later on a Tuesday afternoon, and Natalie heard the engine cut from inside the kitchen, where she had been standing motionless for the better part of 10 minutes, staring at the hydrangea bushes through the window without really seeing them. She had been living in two different versions of the same house ever since that morning. She wiped her palms on her shorts, checked her reflection in the dark glass of the microwave, and forced a smile onto her face before walking to the front door. Mark stepped out of the car looking tanned and energized, a leather bag slung over one shoulder, and a wide grin stretching across his face. He pulled her into a tight hug and kissed the top of her head, and the familiar scent of his cologne hit her like a verdict. Like he already knew, even though he didn't. "I missed you so much," he said, holding her at arm's length to look at her. "The conference was incredible, but 3 days without you felt like a month." Natalie smiled and told him she was glad he was home, and the words came out steady enough to pass. She helped him carry his bags inside, listening as he talked nonstop about the keynote speakers and a client dinner that had run until midnight, and a colleague who had spilled an entire glass of red wine on a white tablecloth in front of a senior partner. His voice filled the house the way it always did, warm and confident and completely unaware of the silence it was covering. For one dangerous second, she thought he might say something. Ethan appeared from the hallway just as Mark dropped his bags in the bedroom. Mark crossed the living room in 3 strides and pulled his son into a firm embrace, clapping him on the back with genuine pride. "There he is," Mark said. "How was your weekend? Did you get any work done on those applications?" Ethan nodded and offered a short answer about finishing a cover letter, but his voice was flatter than usual, stripped of the easy humor Mark was accustomed to hearing. If Mark noticed, he did not show it. He was already moving toward the kitchen, announcing that he would make coffee for everyone because the airport brew had been undrinkable. The moment the kitchen door swung shut behind Mark, Natalie felt Ethan's gaze land on her like a physical weight. She kept her eyes fixed on the bookshelf across the room, adjusting one of Mark's model sailboats that did not need adjusting. She could hear Ethan breathing a few feet away, could sense him searching for her attention the way someone reaches for a hand in the dark. She refused to look. If Mark walked back in and caught even a flicker of what was passing between them, everything would collapse. Ethan seemed to understand because he turned without a word and disappeared down the hallway toward his room, and the soft click of his door closing left Natalie standing alone with a heartbeat so loud she was certain the neighbors could hear it. The days that followed settled into a pattern that felt like walking barefoot across broken glass while pretending the floor was perfectly smooth. Every day looked normal. Every day felt dangerous. Natalie cooked dinners, asked Mark about his projects, laughed at his jokes, and curled up beside him on the sofa in the evenings while a movie played on the television screen. She performed every gesture of a devoted wife with mechanical precision, and Mark never once questioned whether the warmth in her smile reached her eyes. He trusted her completely, and that trust pressed down on her chest like a stone she could neither lift nor set aside. Ethan kept his distance when Mark was in the room. He sat at the far end of the dinner table, answered questions about his internship search with polite efficiency, and excused himself early most nights, claiming he had emails to send. But the house was small, and avoidance had its limits. Every morning, Natalie would come into the kitchen to find Ethan already there, pouring cereal or scrolling through his phone, and the air between them would thicken the moment their eyes met. He would look away first, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and Natalie would busy herself with the coffee maker, her fingers clumsy on the buttons. Once, passing each other in the narrow hallway outside the bathroom, his arm brushed against hers and the contact lasted less than a second, but sent a jolt through her body that she felt for the rest of the afternoon. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them could forget it. Another time, she walked onto the back porch to shake out a tablecloth and found him sitting on the steps staring at the ocean. He glanced up at her, and for one unguarded moment, his face held everything he had been hiding: the ache, the confusion, the desperate wish that circumstances were different. Natalie turned and went back inside without saying a word, but her hands shook so badly she had to set the tablecloth down and press her palms flat against the counter until the trembling stopped. Mark noticed nothing, and somehow that made everything worse. On Thursday evening, he sat at the dinner table recounting a phone call with his business partner, laughing about a scheduling mix-up that had sent a client to the wrong office building. And Natalie watched him with a feeling that sat somewhere between tenderness and despair. This man had given her a home, a life by the sea, a sense of belonging she had never expected to find, and she had repaid him by crossing a line that could destroy every bit of it. She reached across the table and took his hand, and Mark squeezed it without pausing his story, as naturally as breathing. And the simple gesture made her throat close up so tightly she had to excuse herself to the bathroom, where she stood gripping the sink and staring at her own reflection, until the burning behind her eyes finally passed. That Friday afternoon, Mark announced he was going fishing with their neighbor Dave, and would be back before dinner. He kissed Natalie on the cheek, grabbed his tackle box from the garage, and drove off in Dave's pickup truck with the windows down and a country station playing on the radio. The house fell silent. Natalie stood in the kitchen listening to the engine fade, and the familiar emptiness of Mark's absence filled the rooms again. Only this time it carried a different kind of weight, because she knew she was no longer alone. And this time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was waiting. Natalie grabbed the garden hose from its hook on the side of the cottage and walked around to the backyard where the hydrangea bushes lined the low wooden fence, separating their property from the dunes. The late afternoon sun hung low over the ocean, casting long amber shadows across the sand, and the breeze carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and seagrass. She turned the nozzle and let the water arc gently over the thick clusters of blue and purple blooms, focusing on the simple, repetitive motion, the way a person grips a railing during turbulence. Not because it helps, but because holding on to something feels better than holding on to nothing, even if she already knew she was about to let go. She heard the back door open and close behind her, and the soft pad of bare feet on the wooden deck told her exactly who it was before he said a single word. Her heart already knew what this conversation would cost. Her fingers tightened around the hose and her shoulders stiffened, but she did not turn around. Ethan stepped off the deck onto the grass and stopped a few feet behind her, close enough that she could hear him draw a long, uneven breath before speaking. "I just needed some air," he said, and the careful neutrality in his voice made it obvious that fresh air was the last thing he had come looking for. Natalie nodded without turning, keeping her eyes on the water pooling around the base of the bushes. The silence between them stretched until it became its own kind of noise, louder than the waves and the wind and the distant call of gulls circling above the shoreline. She willed him to go back inside, to spare them both the conversation she could feel building like pressure behind a dam. But Ethan had never been the kind of person who could leave something unresolved. "You have been avoiding me," he said, and the words were not an accusation but something closer to a wound spoken out loud. Natalie closed her eyes for a moment and let the truth of it sit between them. "Yes," she said quietly, "because I have to, not because she wanted to." He took a step closer and she could feel the warmth of his presence behind her like standing near an open flame. She wanted to step forward, to keep distance between them the way she had been doing all week, but her feet stayed planted in the damp grass as though the ground itself had decided she was not going anywhere. Ethan's voice dropped lower, rough with the effort of holding back everything that was pressing against his ribs. "I have tried, Natalie. I have tried to act like nothing happened, to sit across from you at dinner and talk about internship deadlines and weather forecasts as if that morning never existed. But every time I close my eyes, I'm back on that sofa and your hand is in mine, and everything else disappears." She finally turned to face him, and the look in his eyes nearly broke her open. It was not desire, or at least not only desire. It was the helpless exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a losing battle against his own heart and has finally run out of strategies. "I know," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. She gripped the hose tighter until her knuckles turned white and the rubber dug into her palm. "I see it too, every morning when I walk into the kitchen, and you are already there. Every time we pass each other in the hallway, and I have to look at the wall instead of your face because if I look at you, I will remember everything. And I cannot afford to remember, Ethan. I cannot." He swallowed hard, his jaw working as though chewing on words that tasted bitter. Then what are we supposed to do? Just pretend for the rest of our lives that this never happened? Natalie felt the sting of tears gathering behind her eyes and blinked rapidly to keep them from falling. She set the hose down on the grass and faced him fully, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her own body together. This is where we stop. If you love your father, she said, and her voice was barely audible above the sound of the surf, if you love this family, if any of it means anything to you at all, then we let go. Ethan flinched as though she had struck him. His eyes glistened and he opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She pressed on, knowing that if she stopped, she would lose the fragile courage holding her upright. What happened between us was real. I'm not going to stand here and deny that. But real does not always mean right. And choosing to walk away from something that could destroy your father is not weakness, Ethan. It is the hardest thing either of us will ever have to do. He stood motionless for a long time, the ocean wind pulling at his shirt and pushing his hair across his forehead. She watched the struggle play out across his face, the resistance giving way inch by inch to a painful acceptance that settled over his features like a shadow. Finally, he nodded, a single slow movement that seemed to cost him everything he had. And maybe it did. His shoulders dropped and he turned away from her, walking back toward the deck with a heaviness in his step that made him look 10 years older than he was. At the door he paused, his hand resting on the frame, and without looking back he said, "You are right. I wish you weren't. And I hate that you are right." The door closed behind him, and Natalie stood alone in the backyard, the abandoned hose still trickling water into the grass at her feet. The sun was sinking toward the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of copper and deep rose, and the beauty of it felt almost cruel against the ache spreading through her chest. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and let the tears come, silent and hot, rolling down her cheeks and dropping onto the collar of her tank top. The waves kept their steady rhythm beyond the dunes, patient and indifferent, as though the world had already decided that whatever she was feeling would eventually be smoothed over by time, the same way the tide smooths over footprints left in the sand. She was not sure she believed that, but she stood there until the last edge of sunlight disappeared behind the water, because going back inside meant facing the life she had chosen to protect, and she needed one more minute before she was strong enough to carry its weight again. Because after that minute, there would be no excuses left. The next morning, Natalie woke before dawn, her eyes swollen and her body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that sleep does nothing to fix. She lay still for a few minutes listening to Mark's slow, steady breathing beside her, the sound so familiar and so trusting that it sent a fresh wave of guilt rippling through her stomach. This was the price of doing the right thing. She slipped out of bed quietly, pulled on a loose sweater, and padded barefoot through the dark hallway toward the kitchen. The first pale light of sunrise was just beginning to touch the ocean outside the wide windows, turning the water from black to a deep, bruised blue. And the house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of waves. Ethan was already there. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that looked like it had gone cold a long time ago. His eyes lifted when she appeared in the doorway, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He had not slept either. He had been sitting in this chair waiting for her because they both understood that this conversation was the last one they would need to have. Neither of them knew how to say goodbye to something that never should have started. Natalie pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, folding her hands together on the table to keep them from shaking. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The light through the window shifted gradually from blue to soft gold, and the kitchen filled with the warm glow of early morning, while two people sat across from each other, carrying a silence that held more weight than any words could. Natalie was the first to break it. "We cannot keep living like this, Ethan, walking around each other like ghosts in someone else's house, pretending that every room does not remind us of something we are trying to forget." He looked at her and his jaw tightened, but he did not argue. "I know," he said, his voice low and rough from hours of silence. She saw his fingers press harder against the mug, as if bracing himself for what came next. Natalie took a breath that shuddered in her chest. What happened between us was not something small, and I will not sit here and call it a mistake because that would be a lie. But it has to be the end, not the beginning. Ethan's eyes glistened and he blinked quickly, turning his gaze toward the window where the sunrise was now painting the sky in bands of amber and pink. "I have never felt anything like this before," he said, and his voice broke slightly on the last word. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin one final time. And both of them knew it had to be the last. He turned his palm upward and held her fingers gently, and they sat like that without speaking. A silent farewell that carried the full weight of everything they would never say out loud. 1 week later, Ethan came downstairs during dinner with his phone in his hand and a strange expression on his face, something caught between disbelief and excitement. He had received an offer from a tech startup in San Francisco, the kind of internship he had spent months applying for, and the position started in 2 weeks. Mark pushed his chair back and crossed the room to wrap his son in a bear hug so tight it lifted Ethan slightly off the floor. "That is my boy," Mark said, his voice thick with pride. "I always knew you would land something incredible." Natalie watched from her seat at the table, a smile fixed on her face while something inside her chest cracked open and closed again in the span of a single breath. Relief and loss arriving at the same time. The day Ethan left, the morning air was cool and heavy with the smell of salt. Mark loaded the last suitcase into the trunk and went back inside to grab a thermos of coffee for the road, leaving Natalie and Ethan standing alone by the car. She stepped forward and pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than it should have. Neither of them tried to be the first to let go. Her arms tight around his shoulders and her face pressed against his collar. "Take care of yourself out there," she whispered, and he nodded against her hair, his hands gripping the back of her sweater. "You too, Natalie," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like both a promise and a goodbye. He pulled away, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. She stood in the driveway with her arms crossed over her chest and watched the car roll down the gravel path, past the sea oats, and onto the coastal road until it became a small, dark shape against the bright morning horizon, and then nothing at all. And just like that, that chapter of her life was over. She stayed there for a while, the breeze pulling at her hair and the sun warming the side of her face, listening to the waves break against the shore in their endless, patient rhythm. From inside the cottage, she heard Mark's voice calling her name. Something about breakfast, something ordinary and comfortable, and the sound of it tugged at her like a rope tied to the life she had chosen. She turned away from the empty road and walked back toward the front door. But just before she reached it, she paused with her hand on the frame, the same spot where Ethan's hand had rested the evening he told her she was right. She stood there for 3 heartbeats, feeling the wood warm beneath her fingers. Some doors closed quietly, and then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Some choices don't feel like victories, just necessary endings. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us whether you think Natalie made the right choice, or if some feelings are too powerful to simply walk away from, and subscribe to Sinner Stories so you never miss a new video.